Now, Elizabeth Holmes came up with the concept of a quick and simple blood test in 2003 when she was just a 19-year-old student at Stanford. She pitched the idea to several professors and experts who all said it was impossible. But finally, somebody believed in her, the dean of engineering, who became a board member and helped her meet with venture capitalists. For the next 10 years, Elizabeth quietly grew the company under the radar. Minus getting some attention for attracting a board of directors that reads like a U.S. presidential cabinet roll call, four-star General James Mattis, who a few years later went on to be Trump's defense secretary, was on the board of directors, as well as former secretaries of state Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, former defense secretary William Perry, retired U.S. Admiral Gary Roughead, former U.S. Senator Sam Nunn, as well as former Wells Fargo chairman and CEO Richard Kovacevic. Not only did the company have an all-star board of directors, but prominent investors as well. Betsy DeVos and the Walton family were big investors, as well as media titans Rupert Murdoch and the Cox family. Theranos raised a total of $700 million from investors in total. So things were going great. And it sounds like the bases were covered with former government officials sitting on the board and media titans heavily invested. The company was set up to be in the good graces of the nation's elite and would likely enjoy preferred treatment by the government and the media. In 2013, the company finally garnered some of that media attention for striking a partnership with Walgreens and a year earlier with Safeway. Editor-in-chief of Medscape, Eric Topol, praised Elizabeth Holmes' Theranos technology as phenomenal, creating buzz and excitement around the company. And you might recognize Eric Topol as a prominent COVID pandemic voice who is aligned with Fauci and continues to advocate for vaccines and boosters to stop the spread. Eric works closely with the NIH and has been given nearly $250 million from the Institute for Research. So it's not a surprise he's aligned with Fauci's pandemic response. He even wins awards with Fauci. But back to Theranos. After the next few years, after the Walgreens partnership, business began to really boom for the company. The Cleveland Clinic announced a partnership. Theranos became the lab work provider for AmeriHealth, Caritas, and Capital Blue Cross. Theranos was named the 2015 Bioscience Company of the Year by the Arizona Bioindustry Association, and the FDA approved their fingerstick blood testing device for herpes simplex 1. So things were going great. The company received a valuation of $9 billion, and Elizabeth Holmes was praised as the next Steve Jobs. She even copied his style of only wearing black turtlenecks, and she was also named by Forbes as the youngest and wealthiest self-made female billionaire in America. Then came the downfall. While everyone was still high on the Theranos hog, in 2015, Stanford professor Dr. John Ioannidis was the first to criticize the company in the Journal of American Medical Association. He pointed out that the company had no peer-reviewed research and operated in secret. Now, you might recognize Dr. Ioannidis' name because he was censored early on in the pandemic for criticizing lockdown measures and scrutinizing the initial data from the Imperial College of London. But after his public criticism, more criticism followed. By October of 2015, John Carreyrou from the Wall Street Journal exposed the company's machines gave inaccurate results and at times was actually using run-of-the-mill standard blood testing equipment instead. Theranos fought back. They hired attorneys and attempted to halt further negative reporting by contacting investor Rupert Murdoch. Earlier, they had also invited then Vice President Joe Biden for a tour where he called Elizabeth Holmes inspiring. It was later reported by John Carreyrou that the company had actually set up a fake lab for Biden to tour. But despite their efforts, it was too late. The company was in a downward spiral. The FDA's long-running concerns about the company were brought to light. Various health agencies began to investigate the labs. Criminal investigations were opened. Lawsuits were filed. Settlements were reached. And by 2018, Theranos officially closed shop. Now, Elizabeth Holmes and the COO of Theranos, Ramesh Balwani, were subsequently criminally charged with fraud, with Elizabeth being convicted this week of 4 counts of defrauding investors. She'll be sentenced to prison in a few months. Meanwhile, Balwani's trial is set for February. On one hand, this case gives us some hope that justice does get served from time to time. But on the other hand, the only people considered victims are the wealthy investors who were defrauded, not the average person who took the tests and relied on the results. Also, it's hard to believe that none of the prominent investors and board members were aware of the scheme. But then again, because none of them had any medical or tech expertise, it's not so hard to believe after all, I suppose. It's likely they were just enticed by the money they know the medical industrial complex brings, which is a problem in and of itself.
In certain Protestant Christian traditions, the elect are those predestined to enter the kingdom of heaven. No one can be sure that they are a member of the elect, and no amount of dutifulness can change one's station. But performing good works is a strong indicator of elect status. So too with COVID-19 caution. Good liberals have tried their hardest to flatten the curve, even as 2 weeks have stretched into 2 years, with the pandemic more out of control than ever, not just to avoid the disease, but in order to prove their moral righteousness, their devotion to following the science. The most devout have gone to great lengths to outdo each other, especially in recent months, as the widespread availability of vaccines has eroded some popular support for caution. Recently, The Atlantic's Ed Young wrote an entire article about his decision to cancel his 40th birthday party. I still mask indoors, he wrote. I still eat outdoors at restaurants. I still avoid large gatherings. I'm still writing articles that take a toll on my own resilience to help our readers make sense of a crisis that I desperately want to never think about again. I've tried to put we over me. A birthday party is almost the antithesis of that ethic, an asymmetric gathering in which we celebrate me. Denial of pleasure in the name of promoting public health is an essential pandemic sacrament for the elect. On Twitter, the independent journalist Michael Tracy, a critic of repressive COVID-19 mitigation measures, has compiled an impressive collection of liberals explaining their decisions to cancel various holiday plans. Canceled our family fest, wrote one. We are all vaxxed and mostly boosted, but I just didn't want to be one of those people who caused a surge at our local hospital. The closest I got to gathering was my mom picked up a plate of food from my porch, wrote another. Even though we were 12 feet away from each other and outside, we were still masked. So these statements call to mind medieval monastics who wore hair shirts and whipped themselves because suffering brought them closer to the divine. The willingness to deprive oneself of fulfillment was seen as evidence of godliness then and now. The deplorables, on the other hand, are wicked and sinful, a fallen, ailing people. When Georgia first began to lift the lockdowns in April 2020, The Atlantic called it an experiment in human sacrifice. Remember that? That same month, the Washington Post's Jennifer Rubin assailed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for leaving the beaches open a few days too long. DeSantis' delay in taking steps to save lives, steps that are patently obvious, is reckless in the extreme and morally indefensible, wrote Rubin. This was about the beaches staying open. No state is immune to the virus nor to fatalities, but the difference between the inescapable, unpreventable deaths and the death count that will result from willfully ignorant and stubbornly counterproductive decisions falls on the heads of political decision makers. DeSantis will be morally, if not legally, responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of preventable deaths. As recently as July 2021, Rubin criticized DeSantis for downplaying rising case numbers. 5 short months later, cases are staggeringly higher than they were in July. But Rubin thinks it's time to stop agonizing over cases. And she's not alone. We're hearing a lot of that now. Little changed between the 4th of July and Christmas, though, except that a great many COVID-19 cautious liberals finally caught it themselves. Despite their best efforts, and the Biden administration has admitted that it's time to move on. In December 2020, the actress Alyssa Milano, who at the time was recovering from a case of long COVID, wrote that she was paralyzed with fear that her parents, children, and husband would soon contract the virus. The fact that they haven't been infected means they are definitely still vulnerable, she wrote. I have nightmares of losing my mom, of my husband, David, in the hospital, of explaining to my kids the very worst news they would ever hear. Someone who struggled with generalized anxiety disorder, I find that this fear adds an entirely new dimension of hell to daily life. A year later, as 2 considerably more infectious variants wreak havoc on case counts, her tune is now this. 90% of people I know have COVID, 100% are triple vaxxed, and thankfully they have mild symptoms. Great, this is the right attitude. Though it's telling that it's only gaining traction among members of Team Blue now that their own tribe is succumbing to infection. Indeed, the sentiment that there's not very much to do at either the individual level or the level of government policy was predominantly a right-wing belief until this very week. Now it's broadly shared by even President Joe Biden, who had suddenly confessed last week that, well, there is no federal solution. That admission is stunning due to its frank honesty. It's equally stunning that it's not receiving more in-group pushback. The Omicron wave, if it even is an Omicron wave, we talk about whether this is Omicron or actually just Delta we've been dealing with, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention seem less confident with each passing day, but it substantially weakened the liberal desire for pandemic moralizing. Thousands who followed the rules are about to get COVID, wrote Angela Haupt, a freelance health writer in the Washington Post. They shouldn't be ashamed. Her article quotes a 30-something graduate student who recently tested positive for the virus despite all of her precautions. I feel very embarrassed and dumb, she said. It's eye-opening that I feel so much shame from it. I'm realizing how much judgment I was secretly harboring against people who got it before. The pandemic era has seen the ascendancy of the ultimate judge, Karen, a slang term for an entitled, holier-than-thou rules vigilante who will report strangers to their bosses or even the police for failing to don a mask or stand 6 feet away. At the height of the pandemic on the streets of Washington, D.C., I had several encounters with various Karen-type people who heckled me for failing to wear a mask while jogging by myself outside. With any hope, the twilight of the COVID Karens is upon us. More and more people are finally accepting the fact neither militant masking nor social distancing provides such vigorous defense against the disease. Maybe they do a little good, but they're not doing enough good. Everyone who is long since tired of the cult of the COVID Karen, of the quasi-religious shaming that follows any announcement of easing restrictions in red states and red spaces, should see salvation at hand. As I've noted previously, Omicron is coming for the saints and the sinners alike, and it's increasingly obvious that ritualistic, performative self-deprivation cannot ward it off. Karen's twilight has come.
There have been some recent studies that have shown that, and it's intuitive, just because a kid doesn't go into school doesn't mean they're not coming into contact with people in the community. And Omicron is everywhere now. And so
it's everywhere. And I've been the biggest proponent of testing for the entire pandemic. But even I'm getting to the point where, there are people I know who were sick. They were symptomatic. They take a test, it says negative. They take it the next day, it says negative. They take it third day into their clear COVID symptoms. They know they have COVID, and then they test positive. That's been an experience for a lot of people I know with Omicron.
It is easier to test negative with these antigens.
Yeah, so maybe, certainly mass testing, you're going to catch some infections early. I'm absolutely not saying there's no benefit. Certainly there is some benefit. But it's pretty inconvenient to make everyone mail in tests or you've seen those stacked post office boxes with tests that were sent in.
Right.
I mean, come on. It's what a headache.
Right. I mean, you could rely on some version of an honor system, which is DC was doing these self checks where you just had to say you took the temperature and it was clear. You could do a kind of that type of a version with testing in Chicago. Sorry about that.
Now we have the Omicron. Here
you go.
And another thing is, don't they worry that, and by they I mean the teachers' unions, they're going to erode so much the support for the public education system. I mean, the per pupil funding for, I'm not exactly sure what it is in Chicago, but I think in New York and DC it's $25,000 or $30,000 that the school gets per kid per year. Imagine if you just gave the family, the kid, $25,000 a year. You could get a pretty elite private education for that much money in a lot of places. That's going to be on the upper echelon of what tuition costs at a very elite private institution. Right. But the school gets that money, not doing a lot of good with it.
And is
that going to occur to people?
I think there is a serious risk that the unions are just willing to take at this point. That they're willing to take a political capital hit in order to win this fight. And I think in Virginia, you saw some of the backlash play out there. Some of it was channeled through this critical race theory stuff, but it was bound up with frustration.
All issues must be channeled through a culture war.
Right.
That is how we process.
It's the only way we can understand things in this country.